Fall Out Boy are one of the biggest young bands to emerge from the American Midwest in a generation. Formed from the northern suburbs of Chicago, the four band members are lead singer and guitarist Patrick Stump, drummer Andy Hurley, lead guitarist Joe Troman, and bassist and lyricist Peter Wentz. In early 2001, childhood friends and musical collaborators Pete and Joe, having played together occasionally in earlier groups, decided to join forces in a new band project. Joe had bumped into teenager Patrick Stump in a record store, and on discovering their shared musical interests, introduced him to Pete. In spite of Patrick's youth and limited experience as a singer, they quickly recognized his natural talent and invited him to join the fledgling band. As a still unnamed group, at an early gig they decided to ask the crowd's opinion, and when the immortal cry of Fall Out Boy rang out, the name stuck. The final piece of the jigsaw was eventually found in Milwaukee native Andy Hurley, a seasoned rock drummer and friend of Pete's from the hardcore music scene. The band was soon on their way. Now, following a meteoric rise to fame that's seen millions of album sales, sold-out tours, industry recognition and screaming fans wherever they go, it's time to take a look at these four young men whose catchy riffs and witty lyrics have taken the music world by storm. We've interviewed friends, former band members, music industry experts and media professionals to discover the band's history, giving us an exclusive insight into the Fall Out Boys story, where their influences came from, what the guys are really like, and how it all began.
I went to school with Pete Wentz at North Shore Country Day. I was a freshman, he was a senior. He was a real smart, driven kid, and he was a great soccer player, a great student. And Pete was definitely like part of the big punk bands and the good punk bands.
Joe was always just a goofy dude. I don't know, he was Joe. And he promised me a hat that he never gave me. His mom used to knit these awesome knit hats, and I still don't have it.
And they stick me next to Andy Hurley, and he's just talking a mile a minute and just, you know, totally geeking out. He's all, he's really intense guy.
Patrick's awesome. He's such a cool dude. When I recorded him, he was really young. He was like probably, I think he was 17 when we first started. He was just good. He was such a good singer. I remember the first time he came and he started singing, I'm like, man, dude, you're awesome, dude.
Whilst perhaps lacking the reputation of larger cities, such as New York or Los Angeles, viewed as the more conventional trendsetters, the Midwest has in fact always been a hub for a wide variety of musical styles and creativity. Certainly over the last 15 years or so, the area has produced more than its fair share of influential artists in the worlds of hip-hop, rock and punk.
It's interesting. I think the Midwest music scene is it's not very condensed geographically. It's kind of spread out within the Midwest. There's a Midwest work ethic. People do a lot. When they're into something, they really work at it a lot. And because the cities here are kind of spread apart, there's, I mean, Detroit and Milwaukee and Chicago and Iowa City and places in Ohio all kind of have people, you develop a network of friends easily that are kind of spread out because there's not a lot of places to play that are within one area like in New York or LA.
It actually went all the way up to Minneapolis sometimes, and Indianapolis and St. Louis and stuff. It was just the whole Midwest hardcore thing. We just had our own little tight network that we relied on to travel and meet people and stuff like that. I remember some of the first shows I went to in Chicago, all those kids were there, all the Fall Out Boy kids were there, doing their thing, representing their scene, and we'd come down and hang out and represent our scene, and they'd come up here, and it was, everybody just kind of networked, because I mean, at that time, hardcore wasn't the thing to do at all.
It was the early 90s, you know, when the Smashing Pumpkins and Urge Overkill and Liz Phair and Ministry, KMFDM was camped out of here for a while, Local H too. That's when the Eyes of the World came on in Chicago.
As the third largest city in America, Chicago has understandably become a breeding ground for artistic and musical talent. Local music editor Steve Forsnegger is an authority on the varied scenes in Chicago, the city that would form the backdrop to Fall Out Boy's musical education.
The South Side mainly houses a lot of hip-hop, so does the West Side, and they do not intermingle. At least they don't intermingle very well. And then the West Side is typically Hispanic and black, and so there's not a lot of rock and roll coming from those parts. Most of the rock comes from the North Side. The far North Side, where Fall Out Boy are from, and then the northern suburbs. The further north you go, you're known for your actors. The Johnny Hughes films in the 80s, like Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Pretty in Pink, those are all North Side things. A lot of rich kids.
And it's funny because hardcore, I guess, has kind of developed a reputation as being, at least in the U.S., it's suburban white kids that move into the city and try and do something a little agitating, you know? And it's a reaction to their environment, obviously. I mean, you have these extremely wealthy suburbs, and the kids grow up with everything, and they react to it. And they, you know, so hardcore, especially in Chicago, it seems, which is a very working class town. It's interesting because I think the punk and the pop punk thing came from more of the working class city kids, and the hardcore came from more of the suburban kind of pampered kids, if you know what I'm saying. So there's an interesting dynamic that, and there's certain places where they overlap, but for the most part, they're two pretty distinct scenes, I think.
There's always been a punk scene. There's always been a certain kind of rebelliousness, you want to say. This is an affluent area for the most part, as you go further on north of where those guys are from. And there's a lot of bored teenagers, you know, that really need to do something different. And punk is one way to do it.
It was a hardcore punk scene in Chicago. There was a big move back to jazz and stuff like that, but more for the young people, it was a move to punk and hip hop. And it was like how hardcore you could be, what crew you could be part of. Today, right now, we're in Evanston, Illinois. This is Guitar Works. I help repair guitars here because this is the thing you do. You come to the guitar store and you learn how to play guitar.
We'll have parents come into the store, their kid's 4 years old, and they're buying them $2,000 worth of stuff. They're getting them ready for it. There is pressure, especially at high school age. There's a lot of pressure to succeed.
If you're born up here and you live up here, you're the son and daughter to usually successful people, and they're like the elites if they live up here because it's so damn expensive.
For Pete Wentz in particular, the competitive atmosphere of his hometown Wilmette and the constant pressure to be successful would have a deep and long-lasting effect.
It's really important that people understand how competitive it is up here and how many people like fuck up and kill themselves because they're not successful. It's like we have this, it's like one of the third or fourth highest insanity rates in America, in the North Shore. There's a lot of dreams that start in the music industry in Chicago and just tank because kids have money here to start, but you know, not everyone has talent, not everyone has work ethic. He's stuck in his head, he's a dreamer, he's quiet, introverted, nice, but dark. He was a dark kid. And then all of a sudden I'm reading in the paper that he overdosed on Ativan. And I was like, yeah, that's Pete. There's just an innate darkness in kids' lives. To me, it's weird that Pete was such a success, because back then I thought, oh God, he's like, wants to be part of the punk scene. It's like the punk scene blows, you know? Those guys are fucking losers. And then all of a sudden, Pete is a pop icon, and it's like, well, yeah. And then there are the few that are successful and you never hear from again.
I think it's a very punk thing to have dark humor in your music, obviously, and then it's a very Chicago thing to have a lot of dark humor in whatever you do, because, you know, when you grow up in the suburbs and you're from these nice suburbs and you go to high school and there's no real problems, you kind of just develop an attitude anyway, and you develop this really dark sense of humor, and that's definitely prevalent in a lot of the things they do and kind of their attitude and their music. And it's not like a bad thing, it's just something that is there. And you know, the song titles, you know, our lawyers made us change the title of the song so we don't, you know, get sued. Nobody puts baby in the corner. They've got all these like references and kind of this more cynical view that I think comes equal parts from doing the punk thing, being from Chicago, and being from the suburbs. Because Chicago, kind of a dark place.
when music was being made, like in the 60s or even in the punk era in the 70s, like, you know, times were tough, you know, like, you know, the Ramones, like, they barely had enough